Hello, welcome back, Tributes. I hope everyone is well and had a great Christmas and great New Year. Mine was great, but it did mean that I didn't manage to make a video for last week. Apologies for that, but from now on, we will be going on as normal, or as normal can be. I wish everyone a great 2021. I'd also like to thank Andrew McLean for all the art produced for this episode and all the episodes since the reclamation, as well as my Patreons. Your ongoing support is much appreciated. Another thing I'd like to mention is the Hunger Games Discord that I mentioned in last week's video. I did make a slight error with the link. That was my fault. I'm new to Discord, so I wasn't completely sure how it worked. However, the new link will be featured in the description to this video, as well as many other links that are related to this series, so feel free to have a look. Now, without further ado, let's go. Shortly after midday on the first day of the reapings, Rubeus Dalton arrived in District 9 with his entourage from District 2. After a brief tour, Rubeus stated to the mayor that he had seen enough of the district and that he was ready for the reaping. He was subsequently led to the reaping square and laughed as he inspected the beige tatty rags that were worn by most of the district's youths. Without any speech or ceremony, Rubeus placed his left hand into the female reaping bowl and picked up several pieces of paper, which he allowed to fall through the gaps between his nails until only one remained in his grip. He grinned as he looked at this piece of paper before taking it with his right hand and slicing the ribbon that held it together with his longest nail. Rubeus proceeded to announce that 17-year-old Panatena Skillane was the female tribute for District 9. A controversial murmur was heard from the crowd, and as Rubeus asked where Panatena was standing, the camera zoomed in to an elegantly dressed young lady with platinum blonde curls. In fact, as the camera neared her, she did not move, but stood still and stared straight back, with her lightning blue eyes practically piercing the camera. Eugenia Ravenstill stated that she knew people who were killed have eyes of that colour. After a few tense moments, Panatena made her way to the aisle and was escorted by peacekeepers to the platform. She let out next to no emotion, but Rubeus seemed rather smitten by her appearance as she climbed the stairs. Then, in a surprise move, Panatena smiled and offered her hand to Rubeus, which he willingly accepted. Although a tear or two seemed to be forming in her eyes, she looked around and nodded to the mayor as if to greet him, before smiling back to Rubeus, who seemed to be quite taken off guard by Panatena's more confident attitude. After rummaging deep into the male reaping bowl, he announced that 17-year-old Sheaf Jaworski would be the male tribute for District 9. Not a lot of sound was heard from where Sheaf stood, and before the camera could even find him, he had already made his way to the aisle and was staggering towards the platform without really raising his head, which made it difficult for Eugenia and training master Donald Crane to see what this young man looked like. Once Sheaf arrived at the platform, he shook hands with Rubeus, and Eugenia quickly criticised him for his dirty clothing and uncombed hair. Panatena offered her hand to Sheaf, and he shook it, smiling as he did so, before reverting his expression to that of misery, as he and Panatena were ushered into the town hall, and the surrounding crowds were dismissed. The pair were then taken to holding rooms at the back of the district's town hall, where they awaited their visitors. Sheaf was visited by his grandmother, a frail old woman who had been taking care of him since his parents died in the reclamation. She simply told Sheaf to try and win, but he interrupted her and told her to sell anything of his that she could if she needed financial income. As for Panatena, she was visited by her parents and brother. Her father could hardly contain his grief at seeing his daughter chosen, but her mother reminded her to be as confident and charming as she could be, and that their district was due a victory. Sheaf and Panatena were then taken down to the station, and within minutes of boarding the train, their journey began. Although Sheaf seemed extremely closed and unwilling to have a conversation, Panatena started to ask about his family, and it became clear that the pair were at least familiar to some degree. As the minutes went by, the AVOX present reported that Sheaf started to open up to Panatena as well, and he asked her if she knew what would happen when they reached the capital. Although before she could fully form an answer to this question, the pair's mentor, Jupiter's Monty, entered the carriage. Neither Sheaf nor Panatena recognized Jupiter's, and they looked at each other in confusion as he marched through the carriage towards them, before letting out a menacing grin when he was just meters from where they sat. Panatena started to ask a question, although before it was even clear what she was going to say, Jupiter's interrupted and ordered the pair to attack him. They looked at each other in an even more perplexed manner, yet after a few seconds of inactivity, Jupiter's bellowed his command once more, which made Sheaf jump in terror, and he quickly got to his feet, before running across the carriage and jumping into the air towards Jupiter's, who effortlessly punched Sheaf across the jaw when he was close enough, which made him drop to the ground. Sheaf shouted in anguish as he lay on the floor, holding his now bleeding nose and broken jaw, but Jupitus ignored him and turned his attention to Panatena, who watched in disbelief. However, she quickly got up and grabbed a candlestick from the nearby table before charging at Jupitus. According to the Avox, Jupitus seemed rather surprised at how quickly Panatena was running towards him, but when she was close enough to swipe it at his head, he easily grabbed the candlestick in one hand and her neck in the other. Sheaf slithered to his feet, whilst Panatena desperately tried to free herself from Jupitus's grip. But whilst keeping the rest of his body still, Jupitus brought Panatena's face closer to himself, until her eyes were just inches from his own. Panatena looked petrified, but Jupitus stated that her face was even more mesmerizing in person, before releasing his grip on her neck and lowering her to the ground. After stepping over Sheaf, Jupitus stated to Panatena that she should do anything in her power to keep her face from becoming injured or bruised, as this was where the sponsorship lay. She clearly seemed rather unsure of what Jupitus was saying, but he gestured at her to sit down with him in the window, and once she had done so, Jupitus told Sheaf, who was trying to stop his nose from bleeding, to hurry up and sit down with them as well. Jupitus snapped his fingers at the Avox to grab a rag for Sheaf's nose, before telling his tributes what would be expected of them over the next week, and how they could make the most of the training time. Both Sheaf and Panatena quickly seemed to become overwhelmed by this information, and as the food for their supper was brought into the carriage, Jupitus allowed them to eat, but during the meal, he almost completely ignored Sheaf, except for telling him to not eat like an outlier. After their meal, Jupitus dismissed Sheaf to his carriage, and although he started to protest, Jupitus quietly began to place some brass fittings over his knuckles, which prompted Sheaf to leave before he found out what these fittings were for. Jupitus then had some wine with Panatena, although after seeing how rapidly this caused her to laugh, then slow her words and become fatigued, he ordered the present Avox to carry Panatena to her carriage, where she spent the rest of the night, while Sheaf could apparently be heard crying within his own carriage throughout the night. Although the train arrived in the capital as the sun was just beginning to rise, many citizens were eagerly awaiting for the train already, even for just a view of the blue-eyed beauty. Therefore, when Jupitus led Panatena onto the platform by her hand, she seemed almost blinded by the amount of flashes from cameras that greeted her. She posed for a few brief pictures, although Jupitus quickly stated that he would not yet allow anyone to have a picture with Panatena, and several guards whisked her and Jupitus away. Sheaf quickly followed from the train, and he was met with a few camera flashes, although just as he was about to pose for some pictures with capital citizens, Jupitus marched back and grabbed him by the collar, before practically dragging him from the station and into the limousine that took the tributes to their accommodation quarters. Over the next 2 days, Jupitus ordered this year's stylist for District 9, Barona Harrington, to try as many different outfits on these tributes as possible, in order to give the pair the best chance to stand out in the parade. Eventually, after spending almost an hour making his decision, Jupitus ordered Sheaf and Panatena to be placed into outfits made of yellow corn with green flowing tulle, which made them resemble a pair of corn husks. Shortly before the parade, Beam from 1 and Spartacus from 2 walked past the other chariots, and they both seemed to be giving the other tributes rather intimidating stares, with Nylan from 8 doing everything she could to avoid eye contact with Beam, even when he stood directly next to their chariot, and Ava Berwick had to try and stop them from glaring at her tributes. Yet as Beam sniggered and carried on looking at his competition, he stopped in his tracks when he saw Panatena, and he quickly approached her, although before he could even try to speak to her, Jupitus swooped in and told him and Spartacus to go back to their chariots. The boys ignored him, and Spartacus wasted no time in offering to show Panatena his sword, but before Panatena, who was politely listening to him, could respond, Beam stated that his spear was much longer than Spartacus's sword. Jupitus proceeded to grab each of the boys by the neck, and a small scuffle ensued between the trio, which resulted in peacekeepers having to break up the fight, and Maxima Liu telling Jupitus that he would be dead if he touched one of her tributes again. However, she quickly followed by telling both Spartacus and Beam that she did not care how long their weapons were, and that she would snap them in half if either of them stepped out of line again. After this incident, the parade went relatively smoothly, although Eugenia stated that Spartacus seemed to have a cut on his forehead, which caused plenty of rumours to fly around during this time, until it was later revealed what had happened before the parade. Panatena waved to the crowd, and plenty of flowers flew her way, while Sheaf seemed slightly nervous, although as the parade went on, he seemed to become more accustomed to the large crowds and began to wave back. Yet when it was announced later that night that Fred and Elmer, both from 7, had won the title of Anderson Fashion's Best Dressed for their oak tree-themed outfits, Jupitus was allegedly furious with Sheaf and grabbed his neck against the wall in their apartment, claiming that it was he who had cost them this title. Yet when Panatena begged Jupitus to let Sheaf go, he eventually did so. Over the next 2 days, the training took place, and Sheaf spent the first day in the sword-fighting station with Jay from 11, trying to improve his skills with these weapons, and by the end of the first day, his skills had greatly improved, with him being able to put up a decent fight against Jay. As for Panatena, she started in the arrow station, and Beam convinced Rosin from 1 to allow Panatena to watch the techniques that they were using in order to hit their targets most accurately. Panatena complimented Rosin on her jewellery, and when Rosin asked Panatena how she managed to curl her hair in the way that she did, Panatena happily gave her some advice, and as the day went by, the girls managed to build up a decent rapport. During the second day, Sheaf spent most of his time in the spear-throwing station alongside Zamtala from 2, although his lack of accuracy made her laugh at his feeble attempts to even throw the spears, let alone hit the targets. He therefore made his way over to the electronic station and tried to make sense of the equipment, but without much success. In the early afternoon, Jupitus asked Asha Seatle if she could instruct Fred from 7 to show Panatena how to construct traps from tree branches, a skill with which he was very familiar due to his time spent scavenging in the forests. After being asked this, Asha gave Jupitus a look that allegedly showed the full extent of her hatred for him, yet when Jupitus offered to instruct his tributes to not attack hers within the arena, she begrudgingly agreed and prompted Fred to show Panatena how to make these traps. Gale Hawthorne overheard what was being said, and in exchange for an agreement of no fighting in the arena between their tributes, he instructed Fleming from 12 to show Panatena how to tend to a cut. It was noticed that Sheaf was also watching Fleming's instructions from the nearest station, but it was unknown as to how much he managed to learn from this distance. The next day, the assessment of training scores took place, and Sheaf put on a careless display with swords and scored a rather pathetic 3, which tied him as the lowest scoring tribute, along with Lansing from 6 and Lilith from 11. Panatena followed him, and she managed to score a respectable 7 by demonstrating a range of talents, including trap setting and medical care. This placed her towards the higher end of the pack, yet it was Rosin from 1, Spartacus from 2, and Stasis from 5, who each scored a 10, which placed them at the top. Jupitus congratulated Panatena on her strong score, and stated that this would likely earn her even more sponsor gifts once she was in the arena. The following day was the last before the games began. A mixed selection of interviews took place, with Spartacus hardly seeming able to control his excitement about heading into the arena, whilst Eugenia said to Stasis that she could tell she was hiding some hidden talents, or how else would she have managed to receive such a high training score. Elmer's interview, on the other hand, made for extremely uncomfortable viewing, with her crying halfway through Eugenia's line of questioning and begging to not be placed in the arena, which prompted Eugenia to cut the interview short and state that she hoped the next one would be less depressing. Panatena's interview took place later in the night, and Eugenia wasted no time in complimenting her on how beautiful her eyes were, and stating that if she were not married, she would happily get to know Panatena better. The camera quickly switched to show Eugenia's husband, Balthazar Ravenstill, grinning and raising his glass from the audience, which caused more laughter all around. Yet despite Panatena's physical attributes causing her popularity, it came as quite a surprise when she spoke to Eugenia in the audience with such genuine charm and modesty, and once her interview was complete, it was clear that she was a firm favourite for this year's tributes. Sheaf's interview followed, and he was clearly scared and intimidated. Eugenia struggled to extract much information from him until she asked about his family. Sheaf then spoke about how even though his parents were long gone, he wanted to make them and his grandmother proud by doing as well as he could within the games. Surprisingly, this humble and honest declaration led to Sheaf maintaining the same level of applause and support from the audience that Panatena had managed, and it was clear that the capital's perception had changed about him to some degree once his interview was complete. As usual, the final interview of the night was that of game maker Artulia Fling, who once again seemed to find it difficult to contain her own excitement regarding the upcoming games. She said that there were some interesting characters amongst this year's tributes, and that this year's games could easily become her favourite so far, which triggered ripples of wondrous sounds throughout the audience. When Panatena and Sheaf had returned to their apartment, Jupitus congratulated Panatena once again upon making a strong impression, and instructed her to go to bed so that she would be well rested for the next day. According to the Avox present, Sheaf tried to ask Jupitus how he had done in his interview, and Jupitus told him that he had done well, before walking straight out of the apartment without another word. The next day, the tributes were led to their holding rooms, where they were dressed in dark trousers and trainers, along with thick jackets of their district colours. Jupiter's briefly entered Sheaf's room and wished him luck before heading to Panatena's room. When Jupiter entered her room, he covered the camera with his cloak, and by the time the guards had come to the room a minute later in order to tell Jupiter to remove his cloak from the camera, Panatena was already standing in her tube, ready to enter the arena. As the cloak was finally removed, Jupiter nodded to Panatena, who smiled back from the inside of her tube, which proceeded to rise into the arena. This year's games took place in an arena made of frozen rapids. Just like the arena itself, the cornucopia meadow formed a perfect circle and lay in the very centre of the arena. Thin frozen ditches branched off from the central meadow and spiralled outwards, growing in width as they reached the perimeter, until they formed frozen valleys in the outer zones of the arena that were covered in blankets of thick snow over icy rivers. Dense forests of thick bushy trees lay within the areas of the arena that were not covered by the ditches and valleys. Furthermore, several packs of Arctic foxes spent their time wandering through these forests, although fortunately for the tributes, these foxes were not prone to aggression. A modest dusting of snow lay over the cornucopia meadow, with the 24 podiums arranged in a wide semicircle, approximately halfway between the edge of this meadow and the cornucopia itself. A grand variety of weapons were placed within the cornucopia, clearly visible for all tributes to see, whilst a fair amount of sleeping bags and tarpaulins were placed just in front of the cornucopia, along with loaves of bread and blocks of cheese that were scattered much closer to the podiums. Just like many of the other tributes, Panatena from 9 squinted as she rose into the arena, most likely due to the startling sun that shone through the bright blue sky towards the podiums. After blinking for a few seconds, she looked along the lines of podiums to see that she was positioned in a relatively central position, with Xantala from 2 on her left, and Fleming from 12 on her right. Whilst Fleming looked just as nervous as many of the other tributes, including Panatena, Xantala was looking around with a menacing joy, and even appearing to lick her lips upon close inspection. Although Panatena seemed to realize that Xantala was attempting to make eye contact with her, she continued looking straight ahead, and subsequently seemed to become almost hypnotized by the range of weapons that lay in the cornucopia. Further to Panatena's left, Sheaf from 9 was stood between Lilith from 11 and Elma from 7, who both seemed extremely nervous of the impending events. Unlike most of the other tributes, Sheaf seemed to be in an apparent daze and simply looked at the ground ahead of him and mumbled incoherently. Yet when Game Maker Fling wished that the odds be in the tribute's favour, and she ordered that the countdown begin, Sheaf suddenly seemed to awaken and breathed erratically, whilst desperately darting his eyes between the supplies that lay in front of him. Lilith looked over and gave him a weak smile, but he simply looked back and then across at Panatena. Seconds later, the gong sounded. Immediately following this sound, all the tributes except for Nylan from 8 sprinted inwards. Panatena appeared to be aiming for the cornucopia, but within seconds, Xantala ran past her and knocked her over in the process. It soon became clear that Xantala was aiming for the boy from 3, who had allegedly called her a moose during training. As Xantala knocked him over and began to attack him, Panatena quickly got back up to her feet, to see most tributes either grabbing what supplies they could or nearing the cornucopia. In this moment she froze and watched, apparently dumbfounded, as the snow by the cornucopia began to turn red with the blood of the first fallen tributes. Panatena looked back again at the supplies and noticed Sheaf fighting with Teleska from 10, which made her appear even more uncertain about what decision to make. Yet just at that moment, she seemed to notice a spear flying towards her from the right. Meanwhile, Sheaf had run straight towards the sleeping bags, and he was the first to grab one, before many of the others began to descend upon them and fight between themselves. He looked over to the cornucopia, but after his face was splattered by the blood of the boy from 8, who was being continuously stabbed in the neck by Beam from 1, he quickly turned around and ran back towards the bread and cheese. Lots of these nutritional supplies were being snatched up in large quantities by Fred and Elmer, both from 7. But when Sheaf grabbed one of the last loaves of bread and began to run, his jacket was grabbed onto by Teleska. She grabbed onto Sheaf's hair, and as he tried to escape her clutches, she suddenly coughed blood directly into his face. Sheaf seemed perplexed as Teleska practically fell into him, until he saw that Rosin from 1 had thrown a knife that had hit the back of Teleska's head. As Sheaf appeared to be registering what was happening, Rosin threw another knife, and Sheaf crouched slightly behind Teleska, whose jacket he was now gripping onto. This second knife then hit Tuleska in the back of the head, and she once again coughed out blood. Sheaf continued to grip onto Teleska's jacket as he peeked out from behind her, even though she was looking at him with a mortal anger. Rosin then turned her attention to Fleming for control of a sleeping bag, and Sheaf was subsequently distracted by Panatena, who was screaming whilst desperately trying to fight Xerxes from 10. During Sheaf's fight with Teleska, Panatena was almost hit with a spear that had been thrown by Xerxes, but she had jumped out the way to the ground at the last second. However, this did not stop Xerxes from trying to attack her, and he was now trying to stab a knife through Panatena's neck. Upon seeing this, Sheaf pulled the knives from the back of Teleska's head and let her drop to the floor, before sprinting across the snow towards Panatena. Xerxes was unable to see Sheaf approach from behind until it was too late, and just as he was beginning to pierce the skin of Panatena's neck, Sheaf stabbed the two knives almost simultaneously into the sides of his neck. Without wasting any time, Sheaf released the knives before pushing Xerxes off Panatena, who was now covered in blood. He shouted at Panatena to get up, and she gradually stumbled to her feet, while Sheaf reclaimed the loaf of bread and sleeping bag that had fallen to his feet. Along with many of the other surviving tributes who had managed to grab some form of supplies, both Sheaf and Panatena quickly fled towards the tree line at the edge of the field, whilst the screams of various tributes could still be heard within the centre of the meadow. Once the pair had reached the safety of the forest, they continued to run as quickly as they could, whilst trying to avoid running into one of the many thick trees. As the screams of dying tributes persisted behind them, they continued to run even faster, until they reached a narrow yet deep ditch. Sheaf, who was running ahead of Panatena, initially jumped over the ditch, but Panatena quickly stated that they could potentially find water if they followed the ditch. Sheaf looked at Panatena in a questioning manner, but she responded that there had not been water available within the cornucopia, and so they may be more likely to find water if they followed this stream into a warmer area. Sheaf subsequently agreed, and they proceeded to run through the ditch, while starting to notice that it was gradually widening, and that the level of snow above what appeared to be the ground was becoming thicker over their feet. After almost an hour of travelling through the winding spiral, Sheaf and Panatena finally rested, and Panatena thanked Sheaf for helping her against Xerxes. Sheaf, who seemed to have forgotten this incident, said that she was welcome, but that he could not see any water. By now, the ditch had grown into a valley of approximately 20 metres in width, and the height of the snow was reaching above their ankles. Despite Panatena insisting that they could find water if they continued walking through this valley, Sheaf convinced her that they should move into the forest, in case their feet became too cold, which he correctly claimed could cause damage to their feet. They began to walk up the banks of the forest away from the cornucopia. The pair travelled up the adjacent hill as a total of 10 cannons sounded. Over the next half hour, they continued walking through the forest, and spoke to each other about what they expected to find in the outer areas of the arena. Once they had come across another valley that lay before another forest, they agreed to rest on the bank of this valley. Panatena used some tree branches to set up a few traps, which had been shown to her by Fred from 7 during the training, while Sheaf continued to keep watch. They discussed where they could find water, and Sheaf asked Panatena several times if she was certain that there had been no water within the cornucopia, but she insisted that there had not been any, which meant that there must be water somewhere else within the arena. Yet, like many other tributes, the pair had failed to realise that clean water could be accessed by cracking the ice at the bottom of the ditches and valleys, which lay just metres from them. However, as the darkness of night began to set in, Sheaf and Panatena remained on the side of the valley, surrounded by the traps that Panatena had made earlier. They shared some of the bread that Sheaf had managed to take from the cornucopia, but as the temperatures began to lower, both tributes started to shiver, with the chattering of Panatena's teeth causing a rather loud sound. Training Master Crane pointed out that as Sheaf and Panatena came from a slightly warmer district, they would be more likely to be affected by the cold, but just as Eugenia asked why they did not use the sleeping bag that Sheaf had taken earlier, a sponsor gift suddenly came down between the trees, and as it was about to land on the side of the valley, Sheaf caught it. He quickly opened it to see that it was a pair of thick gloves, but his joy at seeing this soon vanished when he looked at the attached note and told Panatena that their mentor, Jupiter's, had sent these gloves into the arena for her. Panatena gladly took the gloves and put them on, while Sheaf continued to try rubbing his hands together. He looked at the sleeping bag, but for some reason he did not get inside it, or even wrap it around himself. Yet after approximately half an hour, Panatena's shivering had stopped, and she offered Sheaf to wear the gloves, as he was now shivering even more. He seemed rather taken aback by Panatena's kind offer, but she insisted that he wore them, as his hands were now almost purple with the cold. Sheaf gratefully accepted the gloves, but insisted in return that Panatena get into the sleeping bag, so that it was put to a good use. She obliged, and the pair rested for the next few hours, until Sheaf agreed to take the first watch, and Panatena started to fall asleep. During this time, Sheaf remained completely still, and continued to stare at the lake ahead, with Eugenia joking that she only knew that he had not frozen to death, as his cannon had not yet sounded. Throughout the rest of the arena, most tributes were also hiding in forests and trying to sleep. Although both sets of career tributes were not working together, they each spent the night roaming the arena and looking for other tributes, but as they mainly walked in the middle of the valleys and did not venture as much into the forests, this resulted in neither pair finding any other tributes. Shortly before midnight, Sheaf awoke Panatena and nervously asked if she would take the second watch, as he was now tired, and she happily agreed to this and thanked Sheaf for having kept watch, which surprised him to some degree. As he took Panatena's place in the sleeping bag, she took the gloves from Sheaf, and the fallen tributes were shown in the sky, with the portraits of both tributes from 3, both tributes from 4, the boy from 5, the girl from 6, the boy from 8, Xerxes and Teleska from 10, and the girl from 12 all being shown in the sky, which left 14 tributes remaining. In the middle of the next morning, Panatena awoke Sheaf, who jumped in terror and almost hit Panatena in the face, but he held himself back shortly after realizing where he was. He asked Panatena if she had found or even been gifted with any water, as he was now extremely thirsty, but she informed him that unfortunately for them, she had not. After this admission, Panatena quietly whispered to Sheaf so that viewers could not hear what she was saying, and it was later revealed that she was asking Sheaf if he thought that she should directly ask out loud for a sponsor to send her water, but when he loudly replied that Panatena could ask for water and be sent whiskey, she quickly shushed Sheaf, and she seemed annoyed that he had revealed what she was quietly trying to ask him about. Yet within a few minutes, a sponsor gift came into view, much to Panatena's surprise, but it became stuck in the upper branches of the nearest tree. Panatena seemed annoyed, but Sheaf offered to climb the tree and retrieve it. After a minute of awkwardly shuffling himself up the tree and almost falling off several times in the process, he eventually managed to dislodge the gift, and it came crashing down to the ground below. While Sheaf clumsily climbed down, Panatena quickly opened the gift to see that it was a flask of warm cocoa that once again had a note from Jupitus, which only addressed Panatena. As she opened the flask and guzzled down some of the drink, it was clear that she was enjoying the quenching of her thirst and the warming of her insides. Sheaf sat next to her and waited patiently, whilst the crowds in Snow Square let out sympathetic laughter as his eyes followed Panatena's flask, and Eugenia even stated that Sheaf reminded her of her family's dog whenever they had a meal together. After a while, Sheaf asked if he could have some of the cocoa, and Panatena offered him the bottle, even apologizing for having taken so much, and saying that she had forgotten where they were. Yet just as Sheaf started to drink, a loud cracking sound was heard from the heights of a nearby tree. Both Sheaf and Panatena looked up in wonder as a branch came flying off from the tree, but as it hit the ground, another cracking was heard just to the left of Sheaf. He looked at Panatena with a clear expression of bewilderment, and more cracks were heard on the ground and the branches of the trees around them. Sheaf quickly began to stand up, but just then a large ball of ice flew down and hit him on the back, which made him swear loudly in pain. More and more balls of ice began to fly down from the skies above, and Panatena shouted that it was hail. Sheaf looked at her in confusion and appeared unsure of what hail was exactly, but as another ball of ice came down and hit Sheaf's left hand, Panatena exclaimed that they needed to run, and they quickly grabbed their supplies before heading towards the forest. Sheaf shouted that they should run further into the forest, where viewers could see that there appeared to be less impact from the hail, due to the large thick trees that were stopping the balls of ice from hitting the ground. Panatena and Sheaf seemed relieved once they entered the forest, and less hail was falling around them, until a large ball of ice came down and hit Panatena on her right knee. She screamed and fell back down, before crying out in pain, and another ball of ice hit her neck. Although Sheaf was running ahead of Panatena, he looked back, and for a moment it was clear that he was tempted to run onwards without her, but he ran back and shielded her with his own body, before helping her up. Sheaf supported Panatena as she limped onwards, and he held the sleeping bag over their heads, in order to form a kind of barrier between themselves and the hail. As they hurried onwards into the forest, a cannon was heard, which was revealed to belong to Lansing from 6, when a ball of ice had hit his mouth and, upon a later inspection, caused one of his teeth to dislodge, which he proceeded to swallow and choke upon. Over the next hour, Sheaf and Panatena proceeded to the most covered area of the forest, where hardly any balls of ice were reaching the ground. By midday, the intensity of the hailstorm had strongly decreased throughout the arena, but just as Sheaf tried to help Panatena with the pain in her knee, 2 more cannons were heard in quick succession. It was seen that Fred and Elmer had initially escaped from the hailstorm, but as they came out from the forest, Fred was hit in the eye by a ball of ice, which had knocked him unconscious and caused him to bleed. When he shouted out with pain, this alerted Spartacus and Xantala, both from 2, who had been surprisingly close to this location, and as Elmer tried to drag Fred to safety, they were quickly found and killed by Spartacus and Xantala. For the next few minutes after these cannons were heard, Sheaf and Panatena continued to remain in the same location, deep in the forest, but luckily for Panatena, another sponsor gift was sent into the arena. She once again asked Sheaf to retrieve it for her, and although the gift was only addressed to Panatena, Sheaf was pleased to see that it was a type of cream that should be applied to painful spots. Panatena quickly applied a large amount of this cream to her right knee, before placing smaller amounts on other parts of her body that had been hit with less force, during which time Sheaf waited patiently and watched her. However, after a few minutes, Sheaf seemingly ran out of patience and asked Panatena if he could use some of the cream on his back, which was still hurting. Panatena replied that she wanted to see if her knee would heal first, as she may need to use more of the cream before giving some to him. Sheaf seemed disheartened, but nodded in acceptance and waited, yet when Panatena looked away, his expression appeared to change to that of jealousy. By the time it was dark, the pair started to notice the vague outline of foxes walking between the nearby trees. Although the first sighting of these creatures seemed to scare them both, they quickly realized that the foxes were not in fact violent. Yet unfortunately for Rosin, from 1, she did not realize this, and was bitten that evening by 2 foxes when she had tried to attack their pack. However, fortunately for her, Bean, from 1, managed to scare off the remaining foxes, and stopped Rosin from being bitten any further. Panatena seemed a little wary of the foxes, but she tried walking, and managed to do so without limping. Upon a closer inspection, her knee injury had healed, and so Sheaf asked if he could now have some of the remaining cream, which Panatena agreed to, on the condition that he kept watch for a longer time that night. Sheaf seemed taken aback, but realized that he had no other option than to agree to these terms, which he did so. Panatena asked Sheaf to go to sleep there and then, and that at midnight she would wake him, and he would need to take watch until the morning. That evening, almost all the tributes were deep within various forests, and at midnight, the portraits of Lansing from 6, and Elmer and Fred from 7 were both shown in the sky, which left 11 tributes remaining. Shortly after midnight, Sheaf agreed to take watch, as he had previously agreed with Panatena, and she slept through the night until the next morning. Yet when it was approximately 8 o'clock, Sheaf noticed that the foxes were starting to make louder and more erratic noises as they ran between the surrounding trees. He did not seem that affected initially, but as time went on, and Panatena continued to sleep, the more aggressive behaviour that was exhibited by the foxes seemed to make him want to awaken Panatena. However, when a pair of foxes that were fighting chased each other into the location where Sheaf and Panatena had been resting, Panatena suddenly awoke after one of these foxes started clawing at the sleeping bag in which she lay. She shouted at Sheaf that they needed to get away from the foxes, and they rapidly packed their supplies before running. Even though they were being chased by a few aggressive foxes, Sheaf and Panatena managed to navigate their way through the trees with relative ease, and within 2 minutes, they tumbled down the bank at the edge of the forest, but had a soft landing on the large blanket of snow that lay at the bottom of the valley. Sheaf asked if Panatena was hurt, and she replied that she felt fine, before getting up, while Sheaf lay there. Unbeknownst to these tributes, viewers had seen that all foxes throughout the arena had been programmed to show more aggression during that time, and that all the tributes had fled from the forests due to the apparent danger. Yet unexpectedly, no tributes had been harmed during this incident, and almost all of them were now walking through the valleys. Yet after beginning to follow this valley to the edge of the arena, A moment came when Sheaf, Panatena, and every other tribute simultaneously winced, with some of them holding their hands to their ears, some suddenly sneezing, and Stasis from 5 even falling over in a daze. Most tributes were too distracted by this short burst of pain to notice the sound of ice cracking within the valleys, and within seconds the thick sheet of snow above the ice was beginning to give way. As this ice began to crack, Sheaf grabbed Panatena by the hand and quickly pulled her to the bank at the side of the valley, with her only getting her right foot slightly wet before they had both made it to the safety of the bank. They then watched in amazement as cold gushes of water started to flow more and more quickly through the bottom of the cracked ice, and within a minute, water was rapidly flowing through these valleys. Sheaf looked at Panatena, clearly amazed at how quickly this change had occurred, but just as she was telling Sheaf that they should head back into the forest, he stopped her when he heard screams coming towards them from the upstream direction of this valley. Over the next minute, they watched as Jay and Lilith, both from 11, were swept straight past them by the strong currents, seemingly trying to grab onto some of the remnants of ice or anything that could stop them from being carried further, but to no avail. Although Sheaf shouted at Panatena that they needed to carry on into the forest, she appeared transfixed by the sudden currents of the water, but just as she was about to walk back up the bank to where Sheaf was now stood, she saw Spartacus from 2 emerge from the trees further downstream, with an arrow at the ready in his bow, whilst Jay and Lilith were about to flow past him. Spartacus then glanced at Panatena, and she squealed before running back up the bank. She told Sheaf what she had just seen, but as they started running into the forest, they heard Lilith's cannon, which occurred when Spartacus shot her in the heart as she flowed past him. The pair continued sprinting through the forest, and although Spartacus and Xantala managed to jump across the icy rocks in order to eventually cross the river, Sheaf and Panatena had travelled far enough by this point to escape their reach. The pair from District 9 continued through the woods, this time travelling far enough to almost reach the next river. As they sat down and rested, they heard another cannon, which belonged to Rosin from 1. Viewers saw Beam notice that Rosin's foxbite had become infected, and so in a shock moment, he waited until her back was turned before slitting her throat. For the rest of the afternoon, Sheaf and Panatena rested, ate bread, and drank some cocoa. They once again shared the gloves, but Panatena insisted on keeping them to herself when it became much colder in the evening. Another cannon was also heard when Jay from 11 succumbed to the effects of hypothermia after having almost drowned in the freezing river earlier that day. However, as the coldness of night set in, Panatena became annoyed when she appeared to realize that they had run out of cocoa. She then felt along the nearest tree for a camera, and once she was confident that she had found one, she stated that she wanted more cocoa, and that if she were given some, she would show her breasts to this camera, which made Sheaf look at her in shock. Guffaws and cheers ensued in Snow Square, with various people shouting for someone to sponsor her with anything she wanted. Unsurprisingly, 3 more flasks flew down towards the pair after just over a minute, and Panatena quickly snatched them up, stopping Sheaf from taking one that landed near him and stating that they were for her. Although Sheaf was clearly annoyed by this claim, he seemed unwilling to challenge Panatena, and he simply sat next to her as she drank. Once she had finished almost half of the first flask, she turned to the camera and grinned, before unzipping her jacket, pulling up her t-shirt, and revealing her breasts, flirtatiously smiling as she did so. Triumphant cheers were heard throughout Snow Square, and Eugenia and Crane applauded, with Eugenia stating that this took sponsorship to a whole new level, and Crane mentioning that Panatena could win the games if she carried on this way. After binging her way through the first flask, Panatena said to Sheaf that she would allow him one of the flasks if she could once again keep watch for his shorter early shift, and if he would keep watch from midnight to the mid-morning. This time, Sheaf seemed rather more hesitant to this request, but he eventually nodded in agreement, and by the late evening, he fell asleep as Panatena kept watch. At midnight, she awoke Sheaf and ordered him to get out of the sleeping bag and keep watch over her, which he did. As Sheaf tried to awaken himself and Panatena began to fall asleep, the portraits of Rosin from 1 and Jay and Lilith, both from 11, were shown in the sky, which now left only Beam from 1, Spartacus and Xantala, both from 2, Stasis from 5, Nylan from 8, Sheaf and Panatena, both from 9, and Fleming from 12, remaining. Sheaf appeared to have become extremely fatigued by the time the sun rose the next morning, but just as it seemed like he was about to nod off to sleep, both he and Panatena were suddenly awoken by the sound of another cannon. It was shown to viewers that this cannon belonged to Nylan from 8. She had spent almost the entirety of the games deep in an outer forest, but had become lost without any source of water, and after appearing to begin hallucinating, she eventually died. A few hours went by, and Sheaf and Panatena remain in the same location, but around midday, Game Maker Fling announced that a feast was going to be held in 1 hour in the central meadow of the arena, and that each tribute would be given something that they most needed. Sheaf immediately began to get his knives ready, and Panatena asked what he was doing. Sheaf responded that he was getting ready to attend the feast, but Panatena said that they should not attend, as it would be very dangerous, and they were already being given plenty of sponsor gifts. Sheaf quickly corrected Panatena, and stated that she was the one receiving sponsor gifts. She laughed at this comment, and asked if she had been generous with these gifts, and after hesitating for a few seconds, Sheaf admitted that Panatena had indeed been generous. Then, within seconds, 2 sponsor gifts came flying down between the nearby trees, and Panatena quickly ran over to retrieve them. As she opened them, she saw that they were both packets of bread and cheese, and that one was addressed to her, whilst the other was addressed to Sheaf. When Panatena told Sheaf that one of these gifts had been sent to him, he appeared to not believe her, but when she swore that she was telling the truth, he came over and grabbed the package, before devouring most of the food inside within the minute. Panatena proceeded to ask Sheaf if he would now stay, and whilst clearly paying more attention to the food, he nodded in agreement. Panatena then helped herself to more of the last flask of cocoa, and she stated that this flask was still warm. Crane then mentioned that these flasks had been engineered to keep the inside liquid at a high temperature for an indefinite period. Sheaf and Panatena rested in the same location whilst the feast went ahead, which saw Spartacus and Xantala defending the feast platform for the most part. They killed Beam when he tried to attack them, but whilst they were distracted by him, Fleming managed to grab his bag before sprinting out of the central meadow. However, as Fleming began to run into the forest, he tripped on a broken branch that Stasis threw onto his path at the last second, before tumbling down a hill and into the ditch below. Stasis then appeared and stabbed Fleming with his own knife, before grabbing his bag and running back into the depths of the forest. Panatena asked Sheaf who he thought these 2 cannons belonged to, but he appeared unwilling to speculate. She then rather brazenly mentioned that she would like some more cocoa, and within a minute, 3 more flasks had flown down towards them, and Panatena quickly helped herself. She then jokingly told Sheaf that he needed to tell her how generous she was if he wanted some cocoa for himself. After seeming to become a bit annoyed, Sheaf eventually agreed, and stated that Panatena was indeed very generous. She let out a mischievous laugh, and threw one of the flasks at Sheaf, but it almost hit him in the face, and he told Panatena to be careful, to which she replied that she could have thrown it at his groin, before winking and continuing to drink from her own flask. A few quiet moments went by, and snow started to descend between the trees. Panatena subsequently seemed rather pensive, and like she was about to say something important, with Sheaf appearing to wait in anticipation for whatever this would be. She then grinned and looked at the nearest camera once again, and as her blue eyes stared straight into the large screen of Snow Square, the gathered citizens held their breath for whatever Panatena was about to say. She proceeded to say that she liked the wine that she had tried on the train to the capital, and that she would show her breasts, and maybe even more, if she were to be sent a bottle of this wine. Sheaf cringed, Eugenia gasped, and the viewers in Snow Square cheered, all simultaneously. Sheaf told Panatena that she was being stupid, and that she would not be able to receive alcohol in the arena, but Panatena replied that the capital seemed to like her enough so far, before laughing and stating that she must just be a nice person. Meanwhile, Eugenia was saying to Crane that alcohol had never been sent into the arena before, but he replied that there was always a first time for everything in these games, and that whatever happened after this could be interesting. As the snow continued to fall, a bottle of dark red wine came into view, and landed close to where Panatena was sat. Sheaf seemed bewildered that the wine had actually arrived, and Panatena quickly grabbed the bottle, before taking off the lid and guzzling some of the insides. After finishing about a third of the bottle within a minute, she offered the bottle to Sheaf, but he declined and continued to look at her with a mixture of amazement and disgust. Panatena then stumbled over to the nearest camera as the snow continued to fall. Then, whilst letting out a rather spectacular smile that was enunciated by the stains of red wine on her lips, she unzipped her jacket and pulled off her t-shirt before throwing both items of clothing backwards. Cheers and applause were heard throughout Snow Square once more as Panettana's breasts were shown on the large screen, before she turned back to Sheaf and asked him what else she could request from sponsors, but he let out no reply or even expression in response to this question. Panettana sauntered back to the camera as she swigged some more of the wine and slurred that she would like to be bathed in whiskey, brandy or vodka, before almost tripping over and grabbing onto a branch of the tree as she listed out more luxuries amidst her drunken cackling. However, many capital citizens seemed too distracted by Panettana's display and were indeed unable to see behind her from this camera. They therefore failed to notice that during this now rather iconic monologue, Sheaf had picked up his 2 knives before walking up behind Panettana. She was still looking into the camera and appeared to be about to touch her breasts, when Sheaf stated, "I'm a nice person too," before slamming the knives into the sides of Panettana's neck. Whilst blood flew from both sides of her neck and sprayed up into her blonde curls, Panettana spluttered and continued to stare into the camera with her now bloodshot eyes. Screams of shock and anger rippled through Snow Square, with even Eugenia spitting out her water in surprise. Sheaf then released the knives and let Panettana fall to the floor, whilst glaring into the camera of the tree, and jeers and boos were heard through Snow Square. The action on Capital TV also cut back to the commentator studio, where Eugenia was still holding her mouth in shock, and Crane was trying to continue in a professional manner as possible. As Panettana desperately tried to catch her breath, Sheaf yanked the wine bottle from her hands before inspecting it. He looked like he was about to smash it against the tree, but as Panettana spluttered out some more blood, he smacked the bottle down onto her skull, and within seconds her cannon sounded. Sheaf then gathered their supplies together, without saying another word, and as the hovercraft approached, he walked away, deeper into the forest. For the rest of the day, Sheaf rested in a section of the forest that was not too far from where he had killed Panettana, and he consumed some of the bread, cheese, and cocoa. As it began to get dark, another cannon was heard, which was seen to belong to Xantala from 2, after Spartacus killed her by stabbing her in the neck, presumably due to him realizing that the showdown was imminent. At midnight, the portraits of Beam from 1, Xantala from 2, Nylan from 8, Panettana from 9, and Fleming from 12 were shown, which left only Spartacus from 2, Stasis from 5, and Sheaf from 9 remaining. The 3 surviving tributes hardly seemed capable of sleep that night, with them jolting awake at the slightest noise. Yet shortly after the sun rose and all 3 tributes were now fast asleep, an announcement from Game Maker Fling abruptly awakened them. Fling stated that if either of them was not in the cornucopia meadow within 5 minutes, the tracker in their arm would be detonated, before wishing that the odds be ever in their favour, and ending her announcement. Spartacus and Stasis were much closer to the centre of the arena than Sheaf had been, and they each walked relatively slowly to the cornucopia meadow, while Sheaf only took the knives and ran, although after a few seconds he quickly returned in order to grab the remaining bottle of cocoa that still felt warm in his hands, before sprinting back towards the central meadow. Over the next few minutes, Spartacus and Stasis remained in the forests at the edge of the meadow, and they each seemed to be trying to look for each other within the meadow itself and the surrounding tree line. However, as she appeared to sense the deadline nearing, Stasis sprinted out from the forest towards the cornucopia. Spartacus threw a spear at her but narrowly missed, and she proceeded to run into the cornucopia structure. While Sheaf continued to run and began to near the central meadow, Spartacus ran towards the cornucopia with his bow and arrow at the ready, in order to attack Stasis. As he turned the corner of the cornucopia structure, he was surprised to see that Stasis was not in sight, and it was seen by Capital viewers that while Spartacus had been walking around the outside of the cornucopia, Stasis had turned the corner on the other side, which he could not see. When Spartacus looked into the cornucopia with his bow and arrow at the ready, he seemed confused at Stasis's absence, but she quickly turned the corner and threw a knife, which hit Spartacus in the arm. He shouted out and chased after Stasis, who started to run away, now empty-handed. During this chase, Sheaf entered the other side of the central meadow, and while seeing Spartacus about to chase Stasis around to the other side of the cornucopia, he quickly sprinted towards the structure. Even with the knife still in his arm, Spartacus quickly caught up with Stasis, before tackling her to the floor. While Sheaf climbed up the side of the cornucopia as quietly as he could, Spartacus continually stabbed Stasis in the chest, and by the time Sheaf was lying on top of the structure, Stasis's cannon sounded. Spartacus then circled the cornucopia, apparently bewildered that he could not see Sheaf, and that another cannon had not yet sounded, as the 5-minute deadline had passed by now. Sheaf quietly slid over the cornucopia and looked down at the ground, where Spartacus was still walking with his long dagger at the ready. Yet whilst the crowds of Snow Square were deadly quiet, and Eugenia asked why Sheaf had climbed on top of the cornucopia, Sheaf quietly opened the flask of cocoa and watched as Spartacus walked below, still looking at the forest on the edge of the meadow. A few seconds later, Spartacus passed below Sheaf, who quickly poured the contents of the flask from on top of the cornucopia. Spartacus immediately yelled in pain as the boiling liquid poured over his head, neck, and shoulders, and Sheaf quickly jumped down from the cornucopia. Spartacus tried to brandish his dagger, but Sheaf already had his knives at the ready, and he wasted no time in plunging them into the sides of Spartacus's neck, in an eerily similar manner to how he had killed Panatena. Spartacus stumbled, and the dagger fell from his hand, before he himself fell to the ground, and as Sheaf watched stoically, he repeated that he was a nice person several times. Then Spartacus's cannon sounded. A few seconds went by, and Sheaf looked around at the bloodied patterns on the snow, before Game Maker Fling announced that Sheaf Jaworski, from District 9, was the victor of the 87th Hunger Games. With almost no emotion, he was lifted from the arena and taken to the capital. Due to his killing of Panatena and Spartacus, who were both capital favourites, Sheaf became known as one of the most hated victors of all time. He was jeered at many times throughout his victor's interview, and Eugenia later admitted that this was one of her least favourite interviews, due to the hostile atmosphere from both the audience and Sheaf himself. After returning to District 9, Sheaf spent most of his life confined to his house in the victor's village with his grandmother. He hardly spoke to anyone except his grandmother after his games, and when he did speak to her, it was alleged that this would usually be in order to talk negatively about the capital and the games in general, with future tributes under his mentorship often complaining about Sheaf's negative attitude and lack of guidance. Later that year, an underground network of spies from Scotland were found working within the capital, which immediately halted trade between the two nations and is often seen as a precursor to the Battle of District 14, which occurred shortly after the next year's games.